In 2008, the family that had controlled one of the most recognizable brands on earth for 116 years sold every share they held, and the industry that had watched the Wrigley name on ballparks and gum wrappers for generations learned about it the way everyone else did. The company went to Mars, the candy maker, in a deal worth $23 billion. There was no succession crisis that forced it, no scandal, no debt spiral. A great-grandson signed his name, and a dynasty that had begun with a young man carrying $32 and a suitcase of soap simply ended. One signature. That was all it took to close a story that had started on the sidewalks of Chicago more than a century before, when the founder could not even sell the product he had come to sell. Begin then, not at the end, but at the moment when none of it existed yet. No ballpark, no island, no fortune. Just a man on a train, heading west, betting on himself because there was nothing else left to bet on. The winter of 1891 in Chicago was the kind that got into a man's bones and stayed there. The lake wind came off the water and cut through the wool coats of the men who worked the wholesale districts, and the streets were a churn of mud and horse traffic, and the endless construction of a city that had burned to the ground 20 years earlier and rebuilt itself taller than before. Chicago in that decade was the great American engine, all elbows and ambition, a place where a hog could enter one end of a building alive and leave the other end as a dozen products, and where a man with a good enough pitch could talk his way into almost any door. Into this city came William Wrigley Jr., 29 years old, from Philadelphia, with a manner that made strangers feel like old friends, and a talent for conversation that had gotten him thrown out of school more than once as a boy. The figure that has followed him through every retelling is $32. That is the number etched into the legend, the amount he supposedly carried in his pocket when he arrived. It is a good number, a lean and desperate number, and it captures something true about the man's willingness to start with nothing. The fuller picture is only slightly less dramatic. Wrigley had secured a loan of $5,000 from an uncle, seed money to launch what he called the William Wrigley Jr. Company. In the currency of that era, $5,000 was a meaningful stake, enough to rent space, to buy inventory, to give a young man a genuine chance rather than a fool's errand. But it was borrowed. Every dollar of it had to be answered for, and so, whether the number in his pocket was 32 or 5,000, the pressure was the same. He had come to Chicago to succeed, and there was no cushion beneath him if he did not. The product he had come to sell was soap. His father, back in Philadelphia, manufactured Wrigley's scouring soap, the kind of coarse cleaning soap a household used on pots and floors, and the son's job was to move it through the Midwest, to get it onto the shelves of the general stores and the grocers and the wholesalers who fed the growing city. It should have been a natural fit. Wrigley was a born talker, a man who could hold a room, who remembered names and faces and the details of a merchant's family, who understood instinctively that people did not buy from companies, they bought from people they liked, and they liked him. That was never the problem. The problem was that the soap did not move. Understand what a salesman faced in those years. There were no brands as we understand them now, no advertising that reached into the home, no television or radio to make a product familiar before it ever appeared on a shelf. A travelling man arrived at a store carrying his samples, and he had perhaps a few minutes to convince a merchant who had 100 other things to do that this soap, out of all the soaps in the world, deserved space he did not have and money he was reluctant to spend. Scouring soap was scouring soap. One brand cleaned a pot about as well as another. The merchant had no reason to gamble on a young man from Philadelphia with a friendly face and a father's name on the wrapper. So Wrigley did what he would do for the rest of his life, the thing that would become the single organizing principle of everything he touched. He gave something away. To sweeten a soap order, to give a hesitant merchant a reason to say yes, he began throwing in a premium. Sometimes it was an umbrella. More often it was baking powder, a household staple every kitchen needed and every store could sell. Buy the soap, he told them, and the baking powder comes free. It was a simple bit of leverage, a way to make the same order feel like a better deal, and it reflected a belief he would state plainly for the rest of his career. Everybody likes something extra, he said, for nothing. It was not a sophisticated theory. It was almost childishly simple. But Wrigley had noticed something about human beings that a great many smarter men would spend their whole lives failing to notice, which is that people do not respond to value. They respond to the feeling of getting more than they paid for. The premium worked. The soap moved. And then something happened that a lesser man would have missed entirely, because it looked like a small thing, a curiosity, an accident of the ledger. The merchant started asking about the baking powder. They were not writing to reorder soap. They were writing to reorder the thing that had come free with the soap. The premium, the extra, the giveaway had somehow become the point. Customers were buying his father's scouring soap not because they wanted the soap, but because they wanted the baking powder that came with it. And Wrigley, reading his own order sheets, understood that the tail had begun to wag the dog. A man wedded to his father's product, a man who thought of himself as a soap salesman, would have found this irritating, a distraction from the real business. Wrigley found it clarifying. If people wanted the baking powder, then he would sell them the baking powder. He pivoted. By the early 1890s, the William Wrigley Jr. Company was in the baking powder business, and the soap that had brought him to Chicago receded into the background, a chapter closing before most people had noticed it had opened. It is worth pausing on how strange this was. A young man borrows money and travels to a strange city to sell a specific product, manufactured by his own father, fails to sell it, and within a couple of years has abandoned that product entirely in favor of something he had originally been giving away for free. Most careers do not survive that kind of turn. Most fathers would not have forgiven it. But Wrigley was following the evidence, and the evidence was telling him that his gift for the giveaway was worth more than any particular thing he was trying to sell. And so, having learned the lesson once, he applied it again. Now that baking powder was the product, it too needed a premium, a little something extra to close the merchant and delight the customer. Wrigley reached for the cheapest, most novel item he could attach to a can of baking powder, a product that cost him almost nothing and carried a small note of fun. He offered 2 free packs of chewing gum with every purchase. The gum came from a supplier, the Zeno Manufacturing Company of Chicago, which made the sticks that Wrigley bundled into his baking powder orders. Chewing gum in 1892 was not a respectable thing. It was a cheap novelty, a habit associated with children and the lower orders, something a genteel person would no more do in public than spit. It carried a whiff of the sideshow, of the penny arcade, of everything the rising middle class was trying to distance itself from. To attach it to a household product like baking powder was almost a joke, a bit of harmless whimsy to make a mother smile and a child beg. Nobody, least of all Wrigley, imagined it was anything more than that. Then the order sheet spoke again. The merchants were ordering the baking powder to get the gum. It had happened twice now, the same pattern, the same lesson delivered louder the second time. The premium had outperformed the product. The free thing had become the desired thing. And this time Wrigley did not hesitate the way he might have the first time. He had seen it before. He knew what it meant. The market was telling him, in the only language a market speaks, which is the language of orders and reorders, that the thing people actually wanted was the gum. Everything else, the soap and the baking powder alike, had been scaffolding, a structure built to hold up a product he had not even known he was selling. In 1893, at 31 years old, William Wrigley Jr. did the thing that made him. He abandoned the baking powder, the way he had abandoned the soap, and he staked his entire company, his borrowed money, his family name, and his future on chewing gum. He did not just sell someone else's gum, he created his own. That year he introduced 2 brands whose names would outlive him by a century and would be recognized on every continent on Earth. One was Juicy Fruit, with a flavor that no one has ever been able to precisely name, a sweet fruity note that hit the tongue and vanished. The other was Wrigley's Spearmint, cleaner and cooler, the mint that would become the flagship. He put his own name on them, in a script that would become as familiar as any word in the American language, and he set out to sell a vulgar novelty to a country that did not yet know it wanted it. Consider the position he had put himself in. He had walked away from his father's soap. He had walked away from the baking powder that had actually started to earn money. He had bet everything on a product that respectable people looked down on, that cost pennies, that competitors dismissed, and that he would have to convince an entire nation to chew. He was, in the language of the time, one bad season from ruin, and he would remain in some version of that position for years. But he had one conviction that never wavered, and he stated it in words that would be quoted long after he was gone. "Anyone can make gum," he said. "The trick is to sell it." That single sentence contained his entire philosophy. Wrigley understood that the gum itself was not the business. Any competent factory could produce a stick of chewing gum. The formula was not a secret worth killing for. What could not be easily copied, what took genius and nerve and enormous sums of money, was getting that stick of gum into the hand of a customer in Kansas or Georgia or Oregon who had never heard of it and did not know he wanted it. The product was secondary. The selling was everything. And so Wrigley became, in an age that barely had a word for it, an advertising man. Whereas competitors treated advertising as an expense to be minimized, a necessary evil to be spent grudgingly and cut at the first sign of trouble, Wrigley treated it as the entire point of the enterprise. He poured money into it with a recklessness that alarmed the cautious men around him. Print advertisements in newspapers and magazines, billboards along the roads and the rail lines, direct mail into the homes of ordinary Americans. He plastered the Wrigley name across the visual field of the nation until it became impossible to travel, to read, to walk down a street without encountering it. "Tell them quick," he said, "and tell them often." Repetition was the mechanism. Say the name enough times, in enough places, and a novelty becomes a habit, and a habit becomes a fixture of daily life. He also understood, before almost anyone, the geography of desire inside a store. Wrigley pressed retailers to place his gum not on some distant shelf where a customer had to go looking for it, but at the counter, right beside the cash register, in the narrow moment between deciding to leave and actually leaving. A customer standing at the counter with change in his hand, waiting for the clerk, would see the small bright packs and reach for one without quite deciding to. Wrigley did not invent human impulse, but he built an empire on his understanding of it, on the recognition that a penny purchase made without thinking, multiplied across millions of counters and millions of customers, added up to a fortune. The checkout display, so ordinary now that no one sees it, was in its way one of his monuments. But all of this cost money, and the money was never entirely his. He was spending profits as fast as they came in, ploughing every available dollar back into the machine of advertising, running his company on a thin margin between growth and collapse. His competitors, the established gum makers who'd been in the business longer, watched with a mixture of contempt and confusion. They hoarded their cash. They advertised modestly, and they assumed, reasonably enough, that this brash newcomer with his enormous advertising bills was overextended, that he would eventually run out of runway and fall out of the sky. For years it must have seemed to them that they were right, because Wrigley lived perpetually at the edge, always one downturn away from the moment when the debts came due and the advertising money ran dry. That moment arrived in 1907. The year is remembered now as the Panic of 1907, the bankers' panic, one of the sharpest financial crises the country had yet endured. It began with a failed attempt to corner the stock of a copper company and spread through the trust companies of New York like fire through dry grass. Banks failed. Depositors lined up in the cold to pull out their savings before the doors closed. Credit froze. The stock market lost nearly half its value from its peak. There was, at that time, no Federal Reserve to backstop the system, no central bank to inject liquidity and calm the markets. The rescue, when it came, was orchestrated privately by the financier J.P. Morgan, who locked bankers in his library and refused to let them leave until they had agreed to pool their money and save the system. The crisis passed, but it left a lesson burned into the memory of American business, and it seeded the argument that a central authority was needed to prevent such panics in the future. The Federal Reserve would be created 6 years later, in 1913. For a man like Wrigley, running on borrowed money and thin margins, a financial panic should have been a death sentence. Credit was exactly what he depended on, and credit was exactly what the panic destroyed. Every instinct of survival, every piece of conventional advice pointed in one direction: cut spending, slash the advertising budget, conserve cash, hunker down and wait for the storm to pass. His competitors did precisely this. They pulled back their advertising, tightened their belts, and retreated to safety, waiting out the crisis in the sensible manner of men who wished to still be in business when it ended. Wrigley did the opposite. In the middle of the panic, when money was scarcest and fear was highest and every rival was retreating, he borrowed $250,000 and spent it on advertising. It is difficult at this distance to convey how audacious that was. $250,000 in 1907 was an enormous sum, the equivalent of many millions today, a figure that would have represented years of profit for most companies. To borrow it during a credit panic, when lenders were calling in loans rather than making new ones, when the whole logic of the moment said to preserve cash at all costs, was the kind of gamble that either makes a man or destroys him. Wrigley had no cushion beneath him if it failed, but he had reasoned his way to a conclusion that only made sense if you understood his particular genius. Every competitor was going quiet. The advertising space they had occupied was suddenly empty and cheap, and into that silence, a single loud voice would carry farther than it ever could in normal times. If everyone else stopped shouting, the man who kept shouting would own the entire conversation. He was right. The gamble did not just survive the panic, it transformed the company. In 1907, the year of the panic, Wrigley's sales stood at roughly $170,000. 3 years later, in 1910, they had reached $3 million. The company had grown nearly 18-fold in the span of 3 years, riding an advertising campaign funded by a loan taken out at the worst possible moment. Wrigley's spearmint became the best-selling gum in the world. The novelty that respectable people had looked down upon 2 decades earlier was now in the pocket of half the country, and the name on the wrapper belonged to a man who had arrived in Chicago unable to sell soap. He was not finished. Having learned that reaching customers directly was the whole game, Wrigley pushed direct mail to a scale that had rarely been attempted. He turned to the telephone directories of the United States, those thick books listing the name and address of every household that had a phone, and he used them as a map of the entire consuming public. To the names in those directories he mailed free samples of his gum, sticks of spearmint sent unsolicited into homes across the country, an act of generosity that was also an act of conquest. Accounts differ on the exact scale and timing of these efforts. Some place a major campaign around 1915, reaching perhaps 1.5 million households. Others describe later mailings that reached far more, into the millions. What is not in dispute is the principle behind them, which was the same principle that had launched the whole enterprise on a Chicago sidewalk decades before. Everybody likes something extra, for nothing. Give the thing away, and the giving becomes the selling. By 1910, the dominance was effectively established. The established gum makers, the ones who had hoarded their cash and cut their advertising and waited out the panic in prudent silence, emerged to find that the ground had shifted beneath them. The market they thought they understood now belonged, in large part, to the man they had dismissed. Some were absorbed, some were simply overwhelmed. The industry that had regarded chewing gum as a cheap novelty now had a giant standing over it, and the giant's name was Wrigley. He had spent 19 years turning a failure into an empire, converting the accident of a giveaway into a philosophy, and the philosophy into a fortune. He had a product in every pocket and a name on every billboard. He had money now, real money. the kind that came in faster than a man could spend it even at his rate of spending. And a man with that kind of money, in a city like Chicago, in an age like that one, begins to think about what he might buy that is larger than a company. A man who has conquered the counters of America starts to look at the things that cannot be sold at a counter at all. A baseball team, perhaps, or an island. He started with the baseball team, and he started small, which was not his usual way. In 1916, William Wrigley Jr. bought a minority stake in the Chicago Cubs for $50,000. For a man whose company was clearing millions, this was a modest entry, the kind of position a cautious investor takes when he wants a seat at the table without the burden of running the room. But caution was never Wrigley's nature, and the minority stake was not a destination. It was a door left ajar. By 1921, he had pushed through it and acquired majority control of the franchise. The man who had learned that the whole game was reaching people directly now owned one of the most direct ways ever devised to reach them: a ballpark, a crowd, a summer afternoon repeated across a season, across a lifetime, a ritual that pulled the same people back again and again with a loyalty no advertisement could purchase. Wrigley understood exactly what he had bought, and he never pretended otherwise. Baseball, he once said, is too much of a business to be a sport and too much of a sport to be a business. It was a sentence that only a certain kind of man could produce, a man who had spent his life standing precisely on that seam, converting play into profit and profit back into something that looked like play. He did not buy the Cubs to make money in any direct sense. He bought them the way he had bought everything else in his life, as a vehicle. The team was a marketing instrument the size of a city block, a way of stitching the Wrigley name into the emotional life of Chicago so deeply that it could never be dislodged. And here the psychology of the man comes into focus, because Wrigley was not the sort of owner who buys a franchise and then vanishes into a luxury box to count receipts. He was a builder. He acquired institutions in order to shape them, to press his own vision into them until they bore his fingerprints permanently. The ballpark on the north side, the field that had been known as Weeman Park, was renamed Wrigley Field in 1926. It was a naming that told the truth about the enterprise. This was no longer simply a place where a team played. It was a monument, and the monument carried his name. The transformation of that ballpark into a civic cathedral happened in stages, and much of it belonged not to William but to his son. In 1937, Philip K. Wrigley oversaw the changes that would fix the park in the American imagination for the next century. He installed the hand-turned scoreboard in center field, an object operated by human hands, numbers slid into place by men working inside its green shell, a deliberate refusal of automation that would come to feel more precious with every passing decade. And he planted ivy against the outfield walls. The ivy was not an accident of neglect. It was a decision, a softening, an attempt to give a hard brick stadium the intimacy of a garden, to make a commercial venue feel like a place you might have known your whole life. The bleachers filled with a culture of their own, a crowd that came not for corporate hospitality, but for the simple, accessible pleasure of the game, tickets a working family could afford, a summer afternoon within reach of almost anyone. What Wrigley built on the north side was durable in a way that even his gum was not. Wrappers are discarded. A ballpark endures. Generations of Chicagoans would grow up walking through those turnstiles, and the name over the entrance would become as fixed in their minds as the name of their own street. The strategy worked so completely that it eventually erased itself, the marketing dissolving into memory until people no longer thought of Wrigley Field as an advertisement at all. It was simply Wrigley Field, a fact of the city, as permanent as the lake. But there is another way to read the purchase, and the family would spend the next 90 years learning it. The Cubs were an asset, the most visible thing the Wrigleys owned, more famous in some quarters than the gum itself. They were also a drain. A baseball team is not a chewing gum factory. It does not produce a reliable margin. It requires constant capital, players and salaries and the endless upkeep of an old stadium, and it delivers championships on no schedule that money can command. For the Wrigley family, the team became a vanity asset in the truest sense, a thing owned for what it represented rather than what it returned, subsidized year after year by the immense profits pouring out of the gum empire. The candy paid for the pastime. The counters of America underwrote the box scores. and for as long as the gum flowed, no one questioned the arrangement, because the prestige of owning the Cubs was worth more to William Wrigley Jr. than any dividend a well-run investment might have paid. That was the pattern of the man in his prime. He did not accumulate money to hold it. He accumulated money in order to convert it into permanence, into things that would outlast him and carry his name forward. A team was one such thing, but a team, however grand, still sat inside a city, subject to a city's rules and a city's boundaries. Wrigley's ambition had never respected boundaries. Having bought an institution, he now turned to something larger, something that no other American businessman of his stature had quite dared to acquire in full. He bought an island. In 1919, William Wrigley Jr. purchased a controlling interest in the Santa Catalina Island Company, and before long he had acquired nearly all of its shares, making himself the sole owner of Catalina Island. It sat 22 miles off the coast of Los Angeles, a ragged stretch of mountain and cove rising out of the Pacific, close enough to the mainland to be reached in an afternoon, and far enough to feel like another world. Most men who make a fortune buy a house, some buy several. William Wrigley bought geography. He bought a piece of the earth large enough to hold towns, roads, and its own weather, and he set about doing to it what he had done to the ballpark and the gum before it. He shaped it into a monument. His vision for Catalina was, in his own words, a playground for all, and he poured millions into making the phrase literal. He did not build a private compound to keep the public out. He built an island civilization and invited the country in. There was the Hotel Atwater, lodging for visitors who arrived by boat across the channel. There was a reservoir to supply the water that any real settlement requires. There was a flying boat service, aircraft that lifted off the water and carried passengers from the mainland to the island in a way that must have seemed, in the early 20s, like something out of a dream. He cut stagecoach roads across the rugged interior so that visitors could see the island's wild heart. And because the two halves of his empire were never far apart in his mind, he built a spring training facility on the island for his Chicago Cubs, who would train there every spring from 1921 until 1951. The gum fortune had bought a team, and the team came to the island the fortune had also bought, and the whole apparatus circled back on itself, each piece reinforcing the others in a closed system of Wrigley's own design. The crowning achievement rose above the harbour at Avalon, and opened in 1929. The Catalina Casino was not a casino in the gambling sense. It was a monument to leisure, a circular building of astonishing ambition, and it contained the largest circular ballroom in the world without supporting pillars, an open floor where couples could dance beneath a ceiling that held itself up over a span that seemed impossible. To stand in that room was to feel the reach of the man's imagination, a space engineered to say that here, on a rock in the Pacific, one man had decided that beauty and pleasure should exist on a scale the world had not seen. Wrigley described the island as an island utopia, a heaven on earth without a fence around it. The phrase captured everything about his understanding of wealth. The point was not to fence the paradise off. The point was to build it, put his name behind it, and let the world come. Consider what he had assembled by the height of his powers. A chewing gum monopoly with a product in every pocket in America, a baseball franchise that had become a civic institution, and a private island with a hotel, a flying boat service, and the largest ballroom on earth. It was the portrait of a self-made man's imagination given unlimited funds, an empire built not around a single business, but around the personality of one relentless salesman who could not stop converting money into permanence. And it raised a question that no amount of gum revenue could answer. What do you hand to the children who inherit all of it? A kingdom of chewing gum, a baseball team, and an island. How does a man prepare an heir to carry a thing so large and so strange, a thing so completely the expression of one man's particular hunger? William Wrigley Jr. died on January 26, 1932 in Phoenix, Arizona. He was in his early 70s, and he had spent 40 years turning a failure at selling soap into one of the most recognizable names in America. He left behind the empire in full, and he left it to a son who was, in almost every respect, his opposite. Philip K. Wrigley inherited the gum company, the Cubs, and the island. He inherited the philosophy that had built all three, the belief that wealth existed to be converted into visible, permanent, public things. But he did not share it. Where his father had been a showman, a man who found genuine joy in the spectacle of building and giving and naming, Philip was reserved, philosophical, uneasy with display. He was the sort of heir who understood that everything handed to him had been made by someone else, and who felt the weight of that inheritance as an obligation rather than a pleasure. He famously resisted the inherited display of wealth. He did not want to be a rich man's son parading a rich man's possessions. He wanted, insofar as he could articulate it, to be a steward, a caretaker of things too large for any one person to have truly earned. Nowhere did this temperament show itself more clearly than in his eventual treatment of the island his father had loved. William Sr. had built Catalina as a playground and a monument to himself. Philip came to see it as something to be protected from the very impulses that had created it. In 1975, the family deeded 42,135 acres of the island, roughly 88% of it, to the Catalina Island Conservancy, placing it under protection in perpetuity. The son of the man who had bought an island to build upon it gave most of that island away to ensure that nothing more would be built. It was a reversal so complete that it almost reads as a rebuke, one generation's monument becoming the next generation's burden of stewardship, the playground turned into a preserve. Philip managed the family holdings until his death in 1977, and he seems to have carried the whole inheritance the way a man carries a heavy and beautiful thing he did not ask for, aware always that dropping it was not an option. The tension between father and son was not simply a matter of personality. It ran through the entire operation of the empire, and it showed itself most publicly and most painfully in the baseball team. Philip K. Wrigley managed the family enterprise from 1932 until 1961, and his stewardship of the Cubs became a study in ambivalence. He kept the team because his father had kept it, because it bore the family name, because letting it go was unthinkable. But he was never comfortable with it, and his discomfort produced decisions that baseball would puzzle over for generations. The most famous of these was the lights. For decades, Wrigley Field remained without lights, hosting only day games while every other ballpark in America moved into the evening. Philip justified the refusal as a matter of preserving the neighborhood and the day game tradition, and there was truth in that. But the story is more complicated, and it turns on a single act that captures the man. He had actually planned to install lights in 1941. The steel had been acquired, the plan set. Then Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the nation went to war, and Philip Wrigley donated the 165 tons of steel to the war effort, rather than use it to light a ballpark. It was a decision entirely in character, a rich man's son quietly giving away the material of his own comfort for a cause larger than his team. And it also became the reason, or the pretext, for a tradition of darkness that would outlast him by half a century, Wrigley Field remaining a daylight cathedral in a game that played its biggest moments after dark. His stewardship of the team produced other experiments, some of them baffling. Between 1961 and 1965, Philip implemented what became known as the College of Coaches, a scheme in which the Cubs abandoned the conventional single manager and instead rotated 8 coaches through the role, each taking a turn at the helm. It was an idea that sounded rational in a boardroom and collapsed on a baseball field, a failed experiment that left the team without the steady hand a manager provides. It was the kind of innovation a thoughtful, restless man produces when he is trying to solve a problem he does not fully love, and it presided over a stretch of futility that made the Cubs one of the enduring heartbreaks of American sport. The team was the family's most visible legacy, and it lost year after year, decade after decade, a monument that could not deliver the one thing monuments are supposed to promise, which is victory. While Philip wrestled with the ballpark, the gum company moved forward under his quiet competence, still the leader in its field, still profitable, still the underwriter of every family indulgence. But the ground was beginning to shift beneath it, in ways that the family's culture of privacy and restraint was poorly equipped to notice. In 1961, William Wrigley III assumed the presidency of the company at the age of 28, the third generation to hold the name and the office. He inherited a market that his grandfather would not have recognized, a landscape of candy and snacks growing faster than gum, competitors diversifying into products the Wrigleys had never touched. And there was a specific quiet revolution that the family was slow to answer. In 1960, American Chicle introduced a sugarless gum called Trident, and with it a new idea about what chewing gum could be, no longer a sweet indulgence but something a dentist might tolerate, something that fit a country beginning to worry about sugar and teeth and health. It was exactly the kind of innovation the elder William Wrigley might have seized and amplified with a loan and a wall of advertising. But this was a different family in a different era, restrained where the founder had been aggressive, cautious where he had been reckless, and Wrigley was slow to counter the sugarless tide. The company remained the industry leader, but leadership held through momentum is a different thing from leadership pressed forward by hunger, and a careful observer of the numbers could sense the difference. The empire was not collapsing, it was calcifying, holding its shape while the world around it accelerated. Then came the year that broke the arrangement that had held for 6 decades. In 1977, both Philip K. Wrigley and his wife, Helen, died within 2 months of each other. The near-simultaneous deaths triggered an estate tax bill of staggering size, estimated at $40 to $50 million, a sum the family had to produce from an inheritance that was rich in assets, but not in the liquid cash that tax collectors require. And when a family that has spent generations converting money into monuments is suddenly asked to convert those monuments back into money, something has to be sold. The gum company was the engine. No one would sell the engine. Which left the vanity asset, the drain that the gum had subsidized for more than half a century, the thing that had never been about profit in the first place. In 1981, William Wrigley III sold the Chicago Cubs to the Tribune Company for $20.5 million. 65 years of family ownership ended with the transaction, forced not by any failure of the team, but by the arithmetic of death and the demands of an estate. The team William Sr. had bought as a monument to himself, the team Philip had carried with such reluctant devotion, passed out of the family's hands entirely. The most visible piece of the empire was gone, sold to a media company that would run it as media companies run things. What remained was the gum, and a name, and a third-generation heir now steering a company whose founder's genius had faded into corporate memory, into a market that no longer moved at the founder's speed. The Cubs were sold. The island had been given away. Only the gum was left, and the question that hung over it was the same question that hangs over every great fortune when the builder is 3 generations gone. Could a company designed around one man's hunger survive without the hunger? The answer, it turned out, was not to survive on the founder's hunger, but to build a new kind of hunger entirely, one measured in quarterly reports and global market share rather than in the instincts of a single restless salesman. And the man who would carry that burden was not William Wrigley III, but his son, the 4th to bear the name, who went by Bill. William Wrigley Jr. II was born into the 4th generation of a family that had spent a century converting a 5-cent stick of gum into a ballpark, an island, and a name that meant permanence. He assumed leadership of the company at a moment of crisis in 1999, when his father died and the presidency passed to him at the age of 35, a full 7 years younger than his great-grandfather had been when he founded the firm. He inherited a company that was still the world leader in chewing gum, still profitable, still carrying the founder's name on every wrapper. But it was also a company that had spent decades holding its shape rather than changing it, A company that had watched sugarless gum become a category invented by someone else. A company whose culture of restraint had hardened into something close to inertia. Bill Wrigley did what none of the previous 3 generations had felt compelled to do. He moved. Under his leadership, the company launched new brands with a speed the founder would have recognized and the intervening generations would have found alarming. There were new mint products, new gum formats, new confectionery lines that pushed the company beyond the narrow definition of chewing gum into the broader world of candy and sweets. He acquired brands. He built and expanded factories on 6 continents, positioning a Chicago gum maker as a genuinely global confectionery player, competing on the same field as Nestle and Cadbury and the privately held American giant Mars. For the first time in decades, the Wrigley Company was not merely defending its position, it was attacking, expanding, spending, taking the kind of risks that the founder had taken as a matter of temperament and that his descendants had largely abandoned. To an outside observer, it looked like a renaissance, a 4th-generation heir rediscovering the founder's aggression and applying it to a modern global market. And in many ways, it was. The company grew. Its brands reached parts of the world that had never heard of Chicago, let alone the man from Philadelphia who arrived there in 1891 with $32 and a wagon of soap nobody wanted. But beneath the growth lay a mathematics that no amount of new product launches could resolve, a compounding problem that had nothing to do with gum and everything to do with time and family and the peculiar way that great fortunes decay from the inside even as they appear to flourish on the outside. The problem was arithmetic, and it was relentless. A family fortune held for 4 generations does not remain concentrated in a few hands. It divides, and divides again, and divides once more, spreading across cousins and second cousins and heirs who have never set foot in a gum factory and never will. By the early years of the new century, the Wrigley family was not a handful of decision-makers, but a sprawling network of hundreds of descendants, each holding a fraction of the family's controlling block of a publicly traded company. And a publicly traded company with a controlling family block lives in a state of permanent tension, answerable to public shareholders who want returns, and to a family whose interests grow more diffuse with every generation and every estate settlement. The estate taxes were the same relentless force that had claimed the Cubs in 1981, only larger now and more frequent and impossible to escape. Every death in the family triggered a bill. Every bill required liquidity. And liquidity is the one thing a family does not have when its wealth is locked inside a controlling stake in a company it does not want to sell. The gum was still the engine, but an engine that must be periodically dismantled to pay the tax collector is an engine under strain, and the strain was structural, built into the very idea of holding a fortune across 4 generations in a country that taxes inheritance and rewards the concentration of capital. There was also the matter of the business itself and what it would take to keep competing. The confectionery world was consolidating into a handful of enormous global players, each with the scale to spend billions on capital investment, on acquisitions, on the machinery of worldwide distribution. Wrigley was large, but it was not large enough to win that contest indefinitely on its own. To stay in the fight, it needed capital, real capital, the kind that a family-controlled public company could not easily raise without diluting the very family control that defined it. Bill Wrigley understood the box he was in with a clarity that his more sheltered predecessors had been spared. He could keep the company independent and watch it slowly lose ground to rivals with deeper pockets. He could take on the debt and the dilution required to compete, eroding the family's control by degrees. Or he could do the one thing that no Wrigley had ever done, the thing that would end everything and paradoxically preserve everything the founder had built. He could sell. The conversation that ended a dynasty did not happen in a boardroom, or a bank, or a law office full of men in identical suits. It happened at a kitchen table in McLean, Virginia, on the 11th of April 2008. Bill Wrigley Jr. sat down with 2 executives from Mars Incorporated, a man named Paul Michaels and a man named Olivier Goudet. and over the course of that meeting, the fate of a 116-year-old family enterprise began to take its final shape. Mars was, in many ways, Wrigley's mirror image. It was a candy giant privately held, controlled by another American family famous for its secrecy, a company that had spent generations building an empire out of chocolate and confections, while remaining almost invisible to the public that consumed its products. 2 family dynasties, 2 centuries of American sweetness, meeting across a kitchen table to decide whether one would swallow the other. Mars did not want an auction. That was the condition, stated plainly and enforced without flexibility. Mars insisted on an exclusive friendly deal, and it made clear that if Wrigley shopped the company around, if it opened the process to competing bidders in the hope of driving up the price, Mars would withdraw entirely. It was a demand of remarkable confidence, the posture of a buyer who believed it held the stronger hand, and it meant that the largest deal in the history of the candy industry would be negotiated in near total secrecy, without the noise and speculation of a public bidding war. The gum trade did not know. The market did not know. Many of the Wrigley Company's own senior people did not know. A transaction of enormous size was moving toward completion in the quiet of private rooms, invisible to nearly everyone it would touch. But Mars, for all its size, could not swing a deal of this magnitude alone. It needed money, an amount of money that even a confectionery giant could not simply produce, and so it turned to the one figure in American finance whose involvement in any deal instantly changes its character. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway committed $6.5 billion to the transaction, a sum structured in 2 parts, $4 4/10 billion in subordinated debt, and $2 1/10 billion in a minority equity stake in the gum business itself. It was the financing that made the impossible possible, the difference between a deal Mars could contemplate and a deal Mars could actually close. And it came from a man who had spent his life looking for exactly this kind of company, a business with a product so simple, so durable, so woven into daily habit that its future was as close to certain as anything in commerce could be. Buffett understood chewing gum the way the founder had understood it. He knew that a stick of gum costs almost nothing to make, sells for a small predictable sum, and gets purchased again and again by people who never think about it. An act of small unconscious loyalty, repeated billions of times a year across the entire world. He described his relationship with the products in terms that would have delighted William Wrigley Jr. himself. He said he had been conducting a 70-year taste test on the brands, sampling them since childhood, and that the results left him confident about the future. People, he observed with the plainness that was his trademark, are going to be chewing Wrigley gum and eating Mars bars. It was not a complicated thesis. It was, in fact, the exact thesis the founder had staked his life on in 1893. The belief that the appetite for a small sweet indulgence was permanent, that it would outlast recessions and wars and the coming and going of every fashion, and that whoever controlled the supply of that indulgence controlled something close to a perpetual annuity. The financing was arranged, the price was set, and in the early hours of the 28th of April 2008, the deal was finalized, a transaction that would take the William Wrigley Jr. Company private and fold it into the Mars empire as a standalone subsidiary. The number was $23 billion, the largest acquisition in the history of the candy industry, a figure that dwarfed anything the founder could have imagined when he was mailing free samples to 1.5 million households nearly a century before. Mars would pay $80 for every share, a premium of 28% over the stock's closing price just 3 days earlier. A premium made affordable by Buffett's billions and justified by Buffett's certainty about the permanence of the appetite it was buying. To place $23 billion in its proper scale is to understand the distance the family had travelled. When William Wrigley Jr. arrived in Chicago in the winter of 1891, $32 stood between him and failure. $23 billion is that starting stake multiplied more than 700 million times over, a sum large enough to have purchased, at the time, several entire nations' annual economic output, enough to fund the operations of a mid-sized American city for years. It was the market's final verdict on a business built out of nothing more than a stick of sweetened chicle, and a salesman's refusal to accept that the gum was worth less than the thing it came free with. And it was, in the most literal sense, the price of ending a dynasty. The announcement, when it came, landed on an industry that had not seen it coming. The gum trade was stunned. Analysts who followed the confectionery sector for a living had not anticipated a deal of this size executed with this secrecy. Wrigley insiders learned of it as the world learned of it, a completed fact rather than a rumoured possibility. And the Cubs faithful, the millions of fans who still associated the name with the ballpark on the north side of Chicago, absorbed the news that the family whose name was carved into the ivy-covered cathedral had now sold the last thing it truly owned, the very business that had made the ballpark possible in the first place. Bill Wrigley Jr. framed the decision not as an ending, but as an act of stewardship, the same word his father and grandfather had used to justify decades of careful, unglamorous management. He said the family had a duty to respect the past, but, at all times, to do what was right for the future. He described the sale as the way to preserve the soul and values of the firm, to hand the company to an owner large enough and patient enough to protect it, rather than to let it slowly erode as an undersized independent competing against giants. Whether that framing was wisdom or consolation is a question that depends on where one stands. What is not in question is that with a single signature, in the early hours of a spring morning in 2008, 116 years of family control came to an end, and the William Wrigley Jr. Company ceased to be, in any meaningful sense, a Wrigley company at all. The family cashed out completely. There was no lingering equity stake to keep the name attached to the ownership, no arrangement by which future generations of Wrigleys would sit on a board or draw dividends from the gum their great-great-grandfather had built. The controlling block that had held for 4 generations was converted at last into the one thing the family had spent a century avoiding turning it into: cash, distributed among the hundreds of heirs, resolving in a single transaction the compounding problem of estate taxes and diffuse ownership and generational division that had haunted the fortune for decades. The founder had built the company by turning cash into gum, and gum into monuments. His descendants ended it by turning the last of the gum back into cash and walking away. Which leaves the accounting of what a dynasty actually was, once the family that gave it its name had stepped entirely out of it. The Cubs had gone to the Tribune Company in 1981, sold to settle the estate of the second generation. Catalina Island had been given away, its stewardship placed permanently in the hands of a conservancy the family itself established in 1972, nearly 90% of the island deeded away to be protected forever from the kind of development that the founder had once dreamed of imposing on it. And now the gum, the original thing, the engine that had subsidized the ballpark and the island and 4 generations of a family's prosperity, had become a division of a privately held candy conglomerate headquartered in Virginia. Every visible piece of the empire had passed out of the family's hands, the team, the island, the gum, all of it, gone. And yet the name would not leave. This is the strange thing about what the Wrigleys built, the thing that separates their story from the ordinary tale of a fortune that rises and falls and is forgotten. The family relinquished ownership of everything, but the name outlasted the ownership, embedded so deeply in the ordinary fabric of American life that no transaction could dislodge it. The ballpark on the north side of Chicago is still called Wrigley Field, its ivy still climbing the outfield walls exactly as the second generation planted it, watched by millions who have no idea that the name once belonged to a man who sold soap. The great circular ballroom on Catalina Island still stands, a landmark bearing the mark of the family that built it as an act of devotion to an island utopia. And the gum, the humble stick of sweetened chicle that started everything, still sells at a rate of roughly 40 billion sticks a year, carried into checkout lines and coat pockets and glove compartments all over the world by people who reach for it without a moment's thought, performing the same small unconscious act of purchase that the founder staked his life on in 1893. It is, in a sense, a ghost empire, more present in the daily life of ordinary people than most companies that still have living owners. The Wrigleys are gone from the ownership of everything they built, but the name is everywhere, spoken every day by people who do not know they are invoking a dynasty, a name attached to a ballpark and an island landmark and 40 billion small sweet purchases a year. The family dissolved into cash and cousins, and the quiet comfort of a fortune finally made liquid. The name remained, working, selling, chewed and forgotten and reached for again, exactly as it was designed to be. There is a symmetry to it that the founder of all people would have appreciated. He built his empire on a single insight, discovered by accident in the early 1890s, when the free gum he gave away with his baking powder proved more popular than the baking powder itself. The trick, he decided, was never the product. The trick was the giving, the willingness to hand something away in order to sell something else, to let the small free thing become the reason people came back. Anyone can make gum, he said. The trick is to sell it. And in the end, across 4 generations and 116 years, the family lived out the full logic of that insight. They gave away the gum to sell the baking powder. They spent the gum's profits on a ballpark and an island, monuments that were, in their way, the ultimate free gifts, things given to the public and to posterity. And at the last, they gave away the company itself, sold it, released it, and kept only what the founder had always understood to be the true asset, the thing worth more than any factory or franchise or island, the name, the habit, the small permanent appetite that outlasts everyone who ever tried to own it. William Wrigley Jr. arrived in Chicago with $32 and a product nobody wanted. His descendants left with billions and a product the whole world still wants, still buys, still chews without thinking, 130 years after a failed soap salesman noticed that people cared more about the thing that came free than the thing they were paying for. The family is gone from the business now, cashed out and dispersed, the last signature signed. But somewhere, at this exact moment, someone is standing in a checkout line reaching for a stick of gum. And that, more than the fortune or the island or the ballpark, is the monument the Wrigleys actually built. A monument you can buy for a handful of change, taste for a few minutes, and throw away without ever knowing whose empire you just held in your hand.